So in today's video, we're going to be looking at balance of payments, and this is a really important component of the A-level macro syllabus for the simple reason that many questions that you will see in every exam series, so for every year, you will usually find a question on the current account or strategies to reduce the current account deficit or something like that. So I think that if you can understand this topic, it will definitely keep your options open in terms of essays, because if you take, for example, the essay section of a macro paper, they usually have more than one and you have to choose just one essay. And if you have a good understanding of balance of payments, then there's no reason why you can't choose an essay like that. So without further ado, let's get into the specifics. So I want to first start off by thinking about what the balance of payments is and what it consists of. So the balance of payments is a record of all transactions carried out by firms, consumers, and governments in one country between and with another. So let's take, for example, if it was an American firm investing in a British factory, well, what that would mean is that that would be a transaction for both recorded for both the American balance of payments as well as the British balance of payments accounts. So the balance of payments consists of three sub-accounts. The most important one by far, I think, would be the current account. And the current account consists of the following. It's your imports and exports, pretty much, right? So that's the trade in goods and services. Next, it also includes the primary income. So that's basically your income that you get from investments abroad, as well as remittances received. So if you were to receive a remittance from somebody abroad into the UK, that would be an inflow into the UK's current account. In addition, let's say you're a British investor and you have investments in, let's say, Asian markets, and those Asian investments yield you dividend income or interest income. The income that you receive would be counted as an inflow of the current account. Last but not least, we also have the net secondary income. Now, this is a very small component, which you needn't worry about too much, because it really just consists of foreign aid or contributions to the EU budget in the case of the UK current account. And foreign aid and the EU budget, I think, collectively only accounts for slightly over 1% of UK GDP. So it's not such a big component. So next we have the capital account. And the capital account is, first of all, the transfer of patents, copyrights, contracts, and franchises. Now, if you think about a patent, what is that? Well, a patent is like rights to, let's say, a particular technology. And what can you do with that patent? Well, a patent, if you think about it, has huge value in this respect, because then you can start a company. That company has the rights to that technology and therefore can become the sole provider of a particular good. And in turn, that company generates business. So that's where the value of patents come from. And the transfer of those patents, therefore, could either be counted as an inflow and outflow into the UK capital account. Next, we also have the transfer of ownership of fixed assets. So I think a good example, let's say, would be like machines that would be used in factories. So, and that machine has like a very specific value. And if a UK firm receives like a machine from another country, well, that would therefore be considered a inflow into the UK capital account. Next, we have the financial account. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention under the financial account is like equity or debt transactions. So let's say you're a UK firm and you sell your equity shares in, let's say, the Shanghai Stock Exchange, for example. The money that you receive would be considered an inflow into the UK's financial account. In addition, we also have the FDI flows. So that would be if a foreigner invested into the production of building a new factory in the UK, that would be an FDI inflow into the UK financial account. Next, we also have the hot money in and out of the banking system. And what that is let's say a foreigner wanted to save his or her money in a UK bank account. That would be considered an inflow of the financial account. And with all of these accounts, you balance the inflows and the outflows. And then what you do is you add up the surpluses and deficits in each of these accounts. And overall, what we're looking for is a balance in the balance of payments. The one thing that we want to avoid is an overall deficit on the balance of payments. So after adding the surpluses and deficits of all three accounts, we don't want to be in a balance of payments deficit because those can't be sustained forever. So take, for example, and there's some real life examples of this. So take Mexico in the mid 1990s. They had like a persistent balance of payments deficit, which culminated in a balance of payments crisis. And the way that was resolved was, well, one of the things that they had to do was massive currency devaluation. So the Mexican peso devalued dramatically. And that in itself has its own negative consequences, because it makes it much harder to buy, like, let's say, food or anything from abroad, and that in turn would reduce living standards. So that's precisely why balance of payments deficits, we want to avoid that. So let's talk about the advantages of a persistent current account surplus. Now, for those of you who are studying economics in school, you usually learn it from the perspective of the current account deficit. Just think of that, the points I'm about to make, is kind of the current account deficit, but in reverse. So I think the first advantage of current account surpluses is that it's a sign of international competitiveness. And I think a good example of that would, let's say, be, I think there's two countries that come to mind when it comes to current account surpluses. We have China, which is very price competitive. It's just because they sell such cheap goods and services that foreigners naturally demand very high quantities of them. And in turn, they are able to generate very high exports, and those exports in turn contribute to their current account surplus. In the case of Germany, it's the quality, right? When you think about Germans, like, they are leaders in, machinery production, car production, and chemical products. I think those are the key exports for Germans. And it's just because that quality is so good, like, foreigners and like therefore inclined to buy German-made goods, and that in turn contributes to German exports, which in turn contributes to Germany's current account surplus. I believe Germany's current account surplus is one of the biggest in the world. It's about 7% of GDP, which is, phenomenal. And I think what we can kind of expand on that by saying, well, those high quality exports that foreigners demand is a sign of German productivity. And it's a sign of, well, German labor is very productive and the German overall economy is very productive. And think about economic development from a standpoint of a development economist. In order to achieve higher living standards in a particular society, the most important prerequisite is that we have that higher productivity. And as a result, since we said that our high current account surplus is a sign of productivity, it may in turn warrant higher living standards, which is, of course, something that all countries strive for. Next, we could also say that, well, think back to Germany and their industries. So you said that cars, machinery, and chemical products are three really key industries from as far as exports are concerned. Because we have that stable demand, because foreigners are like, wow, these German-made products are so good, I'm going to continue buying them. That's really good for German workers, because those German industries have like a stable business, meaning they can provide stable employment for employees. So as a result, there's that job security for employees, and those employees may actually also get very good wages and very good benefits as a result of being employed in these highly productive industries. But in addition, think about it from the perspective of the local government, of the German government. Those industries those companies like BMW and companies like that, they earn very high profits, which means they then contribute a lot in terms of tax revenues. Now think about what you can do with those tax revenues from the standpoint of the government. You can spend it on improving your public services, or you could do it to fund supply-side policies such as education or infrastructure. And in turn, that's going to, in a way, trigger a virtuous cycle of, current account surpluses generating more tax revenue, which generates more investment into supply-side policies, which in turn makes the economy more productive. And in a way, it kind of reinforces the current account surplus that we had to begin with. So I think international competitiveness is one key aspect of current account surpluses. And if you think about it, international competitiveness is both a cause and an effect of current account surplus. So if you were to get a question on what is the cause of a current account surplus rather than a consequence, well, one cause would definitely be high productivity. So you could definitely say that in an exam situation. Next, we can talk about what you can do. Think about what you can do with those current account surpluses. Because we said earlier that balance of payments usually are in balance, right? So if you have a current account surplus, it might be made up for in a deficit in terms of the capital account or the financial account, meaning that, let's say, take Germans, for example, they'll use that current account surplus and invest it in industries abroad. So if they invest in foreign assets and foreign industries, well, those German investors in turn will benefit from the potential dividend and interest income. And as a result, that's particularly useful if, let's say, your country's exports are no longer in demand. So let's say I was generating these high current account surpluses because I was exporting cars, or let's say I was exporting oil or something like that. And let's say all of a sudden foreigners don't want my products. I've got a huge problem, right? Because I was so dependent on that before. But the good news is that that dividend income and that interest income from investments made abroad, that will help you in terms of kind of managing that risk. So as a result, you can maybe potentially dampen the risks of, let's say, foreigners not wanting your products in the future. In addition, the current account surpluses imply that the country is a net lender in the world economy. And in effect, that does make you less dependent on foreigners. That means that foreigners don't have as much control over your economy and therefore how it performs. And in fact, the opposite might be true. In fact, it might mean that you can leverage that for more power over other economies. So in addition, what I would also say is that the income that is generated from these foreign assets can be reinvested into, let's say, research and development. So let's say research and development, which can in turn be used to improve production methods at home. And as a result, that money can be used to making local industry much more competitive over time, and therefore reinforce those current account surpluses in the future. So arguably there are some advantages in that from that standpoint as well, specifically the dividend and interest income that you receive from investments abroad. Thirdly, I think there's actually a much more simpler point that you cover in your first year of macro as well, and that is that net exports is a component of aggregate demand. A high current account surplus implies that your net exports are very high, and that will induce a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And as you can see by the diagram below, the real GDP goes up and we're closer to full employment. And this is particularly useful if we were in a recession, right? So in a recession, we have all this spare capacity. So what we really need is that rightward shift in our aggregate demand curve, which in turn would lead to more employment, and therefore we perform better in terms of our macroeconomic objectives, unemployment in particular. So now I want to talk about since we just talked about how current account surpluses are potentially very advantageous for an economy, it therefore follows that persistent current account deficits are a problem. But there are some cases in which current account deficits aren't necessarily a problem. And one is that it could be temporary in terms of, like, sometimes a country might suddenly run a current account deficit because they had a very temporary appreciation of their currency. Now, why is that? Well, if your currency appreciates, it means your exports are less price competitive. And as a result, this will reduce the demand for exports, and potentially this will reduce the demand and this in turn would reduce your net exports. But the good news is that since that appreciation is temporary, you might then go back to a currency that is valued at a more fair level. And as a result, that lack of price competitiveness doesn't persist. And once again, your exports will become price competitive once again. So it may not be such a big problem, like maybe on a year to year, it just depends on how persistent that is. And sometimes current account deficits are not always persistent. Now, secondly, I think this is really important, is that, remember, the current account is not the only component of the balance of payments. It's made up of three accounts. We have capital and financial account that we need to account for. And the current account deficit may be compensated by surpluses in the financial and capital accounts, which means that the balance of payments is in balance, and therefore we avoid a balance of payments crisis. Now, this is an argument that is often made in context of the UK and US. yes, these countries run pretty large and persistent current account deficits, but they do make up for it with their other accounts, and therefore their overall balance of payments is intact. In addition, the current account deficit implies that we import more than we export. So in other words, we're able to consume more than what our local economy produces. And if we're able to consume more goods and services, that access to goods and services implies that we actually have very high living standards because we're able to consume more. And that's, of course, that's good for consumers, right? Now, I think thirdly, if the capital and financial account are in surplus, then that means we have a net positive of FDI flows. And FDI flows are quite beneficial because, as I said earlier, the FDI flows, like an example of that would be like foreigners investing in, building new factories in let's say the UK. So if we have that net inflow of FDI, that investment can then be used to finance local industry and finance R&D and also just increase the amount of capital goods in our economy. And as we do that, that will make our economy more productive in the long run, which would boost long run output. And of course, that long run output and that improvement in long run output in turn would improve living standards in the future. But there's another point, and that is, since that investment made by foreigners would enable us to develop local industries, those local industries, as they become more developed, may become more competitive over time on the world market. And therefore, we might have a situation in which our current account deficit will turn into a current account surplus because we now have much more competitive exports that we are selling to foreigners. And therefore, in turn, we increase our net exports, which in turn contributes to a current account surplus. So current account deficits in the long run, it may not persist. So that's why I think current account deficits, you shouldn't always be scared of them. And in fact, in, I believe, the AQA 2017 paper, there was a passage about the UK's current account deficit. And there was a question about whether this really does pose a problem to the UK economy. And these are some of the arguments that you can use, that maybe it might have been a temporary depreciation or appreciation of the pound, or it might be the fact that the UK industry will develop over time. So yeah, so current account deficits aren't always a problem. Now we have to think, well, let's say they are a problem, and we're like, oh, you're a policymaker and you're saying, okay, I really want to reduce my country's current account deficit. We got one common step, which is to try and depreciate the exchange rate. So try and reduce the relative value of the pound. So instead of the pound being worth $2 like it was in 2007, today it's only worth about $1.50. And first of all, how would we do that? Well, first of all, the central banks can do this by lowering interest rates, because what lower interest rates would do is it would reduce the reward for saving in UK bank accounts. And as we talked about earlier, before, this would lead to hot money outflows. And hot money outflows would reduce the demand for the pound. And in turn, that would lead to the depreciation of the pound. Conversely, we could also increase the supply of pounds through quantitative easing, which in turn would induce depreciation. Now think about what depreciation would do from an export perspective. Depreciations would in effect make British-made goods and services more attractive for foreigners from a price standpoint. Like, it doesn't cost Americans as much money, or it doesn't cost Americans as many dollars to buy, let's say, a Land Rover or whatever else the UK produces. And as that happens, UK exports are more price competitive, and this will in turn boost net exports. Now, there is just one thing. It does depend on the Marshall-Lerner condition. We'll start off with that. Depreciation doesn't always work, and it's to do with the elasticity, because if British-made goods are inelastic in nature, then depreciation, or in other words, lowering the price of UK-made goods and services, would actually reduce the overall UK net exports, and it would actually worsen the current account deficit. And specifically, what the Marshall-Lerner condition states is that if the combined numerical value of the PED, so let's say the combined PED of exports and imports is less than 1, then a depreciation will reduce net exports. So what that means is that, let's say the PED for exports is 0.1 and the PED for imports is 0.2. Because those two values only add up to 0.3, that's less than 1, and therefore that satisfies the Marshall-Lerner condition. And therefore a depreciation of the pound would actually reduce the net exports and worsen the current account deficit. Now, I'd like to demonstrate the Marshall-Lerner condition using a numerical example. So let's take the following PEDs of 0.3 and 0.2. So exports has an elasticity of 0.3 and the PED has an elasticity of 0.2. Don't worry about the minus sign or anything. I'm just focusing on the numerical value. It's the numerical value that's important here. And as you can see, 0.3 plus 0.2 is less than 1. So let's say we had an initial export price of 100 and an initial export quantity of 100, and the same for imports as well. So that implies that right now we are in a balance in terms of our current account, because the export revenue is 10,000 and the import spending is 10,000 as well. Now suppose the pound depreciates by 10%, meaning that the UK's export prices are now cheaper. It's fallen to £90. Now, if you look at the PED, so the PED is 0.3, meaning that the quantity demanded will go up, but will only go up by 3% for every 10% change in price. So the quantity traded goes up to only 103, whereas the import price is actually works the opposite. Imports are now expensive, are actually now more expensive, and imports are 10% more expensive. And based on the PED of imports of 0.2, it means that the quantity traded will fall by 2% to 98. Now, when you multiply those numbers together, so let's talk about the export revenue first. Export revenue is price times quantity. So 90 times 103 is 9,270. And if you do the same thing for import revenue or import spending, really, it's more than 10,000. So in other words, we now have a current account deficit. So we've gone from a current account of 0 to a deficit, meaning that we have proved the Marshall-Lerner condition. Next, there's another factor that's important, and that is the Jcurve effect. It's a bit different to the Marshall-Lerner condition because this is to do with time, and that is, think back to when you studied PED for AS micro. We said that one of the key factors that determine PED is time. That is, over time, in the long run, our products become more PED elastic. But in the short run, that implies that the PED of exports are likely to be inelastic. And therefore, if you lower export prices, you will lower export revenue, which in turn will reduce your net exports. And as a result, that will worsen the current account deficit. And as you can see from the graph, when PED is less than 1, you actually see a worsening. See that decline over here. And then only over time will that improve. So sometimes depreciating your currency will actually have the opposite effect in the short run. And I think a good example of this would be the UK, that even though the pound has been subject to a lot of depreciation since 2008, the current account deficit has not improved at all. As a percentage of GDP, it's actually gotten worse since 2008, 2007. So as a result, I think the UK is a prime example of how depreciation doesn't necessarily work. So we have a second policy. So if depreciation doesn't work, let's think about another policy that we can use to correct our current account deficit. Now think about what we said when we talked about the advantages of a current account surplus. That what a current account surplus implies is that it says that we have a very productive economy. So what we could do is we could maybe introduce supply side policies that makes the UK economy more competitive, makes it more productive, which in turn makes our exports more competitive. So a good example of supply side policies would be subsidies for research and development. So if you subsidize research and development, you're potentially making those products better in terms of quality. And as a result, that would increase the foreigners' demand for your products. And as their demand goes up, that means your export revenue may increase. In addition, we could also have investment into training and education, and that has the effect of improving labor productivity. And what higher labor productivity would do is that each worker in a given hour or in a given year, whatever amount of time frame you want to use, we are able to produce more output. Our exporting industries can produce more. And as we produce more output, it means our cost of production per unit is lower. And in turn, our industry can pass on these lower costs in the form of lower prices, which in turn will make our exports more price competitive because we're charging lower prices. However, like supply side policies don't always work, because if you're a company and you know you're going to get a subsidy for R&D, you may not like use the money very wisely. And as a result, all that money that the government has given you to spend on research and development, you may not be spending it very well. And as a result, it's not going to be yielding much results in terms of R&D. So in other words, companies may not be putting it to good use. In addition, education doesn't necessarily give workers relevant skills, and therefore it wouldn't increase labor productivity. I mean, if you think about, for example, this is a debate that's going on in this country about university. Does it really make sense to educate everybody, like for everybody to have higher education? Is not necessarily, because there's an argument that, well, universities don't really prepare you for, real life work skills. So I think those are two major drawbacks of supply side policies as a means of reducing the current account deficit. Last but not least, we could also resort to protectionist policies. So I think that's commonly refers to tariffs and quotas. So tariffs are essentially a tax on imported goods, meaning that the prices that I would pay as an importer would be higher. And as a result, if they're a higher price, if the imported goods are higher in price, I'm going to demand less of that. And if the elasticity is high enough, then that means the overall spending on imports, so in other words, the total value of imports, is going to be lower. And as that happens, assuming your exports stay the same and imports are lower, it means your net exports are higher, and therefore you can reverse your current account deficit. Meanwhile, quotas restrict the quantity that people can import. So at a given price, the quantity is restricted, meaning that, again, the total value of imports is reduced. So, but unfortunately, protectionist policies certainly have drawbacks. I think the main thing would be that it does increase the cost. It increases the price of imports, right? That's what a tariff is meant to do. But what if it's a tariff on, like, let's say, a whole range of imports? Well, then we're going to have a problem of, well, let's say I'm an exporter, I'm like a manufacturer, and I buy my machinery and raw materials from another country. If I have to pay a tariff on those things, that means my costs of production are going to go up. And as that happens, that means I won't be able to produce as much as an exporter. And if I can't produce as much, I can't sell as much to foreigners, and that will lower my export revenue. So therefore, tariffs will have the effect of reducing imports, but they'll also have the effect of reducing exports. And as a result, we may not make any progress in terms of the current account deficit. So, and also most importantly, think about what we talked about with elasticity, that even if you were to put a tax on imports, if the elasticity of imports is very inelastic, then I'm still going to be buying, like my quantity demanded is not going to change very much. And therefore the total amount of spending I do on imports will still be higher. And therefore it will actually make the situation worse.